thanks for joining us. My name is Doug Cook. I'll be your host for tonight. And along with me is Cliff Hatch, farmer at Upinngil Farm. Before we get started, I'd just like to thank all of the NOFA staff and board who've been helping to make this event go off. And it's the first in a series of 5 events focusing on improving pastures and your products with intensive grazing practices. Also, we want to thank our sponsors, Real Pickles, and they are a worker cooperative based in Greenfield, Massachusetts, producing 100% organic, raw, fermented vegetables sourced from Northeast family farms, available at local stores and online at www.realpickles.com. As well, we want to thank our grant funders, the Berkshire Taconic Community Foundation Green Pastures Fund. They preserve and encourage small community-based agricultural ventures in the Berkshires, and Massachusetts dairy farmers as another supporter. And you can find out more about the Massachusetts dairy farmers at massdairy.com. And most importantly, we want to thank you, our viewers and listeners, especially our members who make our education and advocacy work possible. If you find this event useful and inspiring, please become a NOFA Mass member or consider making a donation. I am pleased to introduce our presenter, Cliff Hatch, a longtime friend of NOFA Mass. He comes from a tradition of New England family farming that reaches back to the early 17th century. Cliff grew up on his family farm in Granby, Mass. After college, he obtained culinary training and embarked on a career as Chef de Cuisine, first at the Deerfield Inn and later at the Rhode Island Country Club. He's been farming in Gill since 1988.
Hi, I'm on, I assume, right?
We're on.
Okay. I make a wide range of cheeses, and I kind of chose the Gouda for this because it teaches quite a few things, and it's really not overcomplicated a cheese to make. It's what we call a washed curd cheese, and which is similar to Colby's. There's lots of washed curd cheeses. The reason for doing it is to get some of the lactose out of the curds, which makes the cheese age in a milder way without a lot of sharpness, because you're eliminating sugar that ferments, etc. And it has lots of interesting things that happen on the way in making it. I started making cheeses, I guess probably 30 years ago. As a chef, I was exposed to, everything the world had to offer in terms of purchasing it and serving it, etc. And it was a real consummation of a big dream for me when I bought this particular farm where we have our cattle. And after purchasing it, I realized that I had more grazing land than I really did cropland on it. And I decided to put some cows on it and start, because I had a dairy farming heritage, to put some cows on it. And I figured I would just have this nice little avocation in the wintertime of milking cows when everything was really peaceful, and I'd make cheese from it. And I got doing my thing with a few cows, and then one day the Department of Public Health knocked on my door and busted me for selling cheese without a license. You can manufacture all the cheese you want, but if you want to sell it, you need all sorts of special dispensation from the state. And they had a guy with these 2 nice women who were busting me in case I should get violent. And it was kind of a funny situation. And initially I just threw my hands up and said, well, let everybody get their own cow and do their own thing, because I can't see all of these things that I would need to do to sell it are pretty heavy-handed and costly. But after a little thought, I decided to give it a go. And our dairy has developed very nicely. We sell both raw milk, which in order to be a cheesemaker, you have to have a certified milk source. And I wanted to use my own milk, so it meant I had to own a certified grade A dairy. And we had the expense of that. And to do that, we started selling raw milk to basically kind of pay for all the costs of setting up the dairy. And then later to start paying it off to make the cheese business. I don't know how long you want me to stay on this, because I can get long-winded, Doug.
Well, maybe we'll take an opportunity to start with the introduction video, and it'll give people a little visual sense of where you're coming from. Okay, I'm gonna share.
Hi, I'm Clifford Hatch, a farmer in Gill, Massachusetts at Upinngil. Our primary product is milk and the cheeses that we make from it. And we also grow small grains, and we have a farm stand with our produce as well as the produce from other local farms. Cheese making is a process of precipitating the solids out of a solution and getting your hands on them and make them into something. It's probably man's first processed food. We think of it now as a perfectly natural thing, but what you just need to do is start with good milk, unhomogenized, raise its acidity until it forms a curd, cut that curd and handle it gently either through rise of acidity and fermentation or through the addition of heat until those curds are firm enough for you to get them in a cheesecloth and drain the whey away. Then you will have curds in your hands and you can form them, salt them, get them into a mold, and make them into a marvelous food. Just feeling my temperature range, because when you feel up here with that kind of stuff much anymore.
Okay, let's give that another stir.
You will see this whole discussion of colloidal systems by Dr. Certain elements fall out of suspension. no longer have the perfect cup of coffee, right? But the same applies to milk.
Cliff, would you speak a little bit about the numbers? How many dairy cows do you have? What's your herd size? How many acres are you grazing? That sort of thing.
Sure. We generally keep about 12 animals in the milking string. We give them about a 300-day lactation period. So it means you have other cows waiting in the wings to keep that 12 going. So we keep between 25 and 30 animals when you include the young stock and replacements, because cows get old. Our cattle generally go from 10 to 12 years old while they're still productive. We basically have our farm during the grazing season. We have our farm divided up into 40 paddocks to accommodate that number of cattle on a daily basis. They get turned into a fresh paddock every day, and then it's really interesting the way they get to learn the system. They just seem to instinctively know where they're headed next most of the time. Sometimes they can act like total boneheads about it and give you a hard time, but most of the time they're really cooperative with it. And it's a nice size herd to move around, because one of the difficulties for large herds is just the time it takes to move a group of cattle in cow time, because cow time is different than the way humans work at. We have a different clock. Their day is divided up into 8 or 9 segments where they spend ingesting, ruminating, and then just hanging out, and then, but they know when milking time is, and they generally will remind you if you're late, because they want to come in. And our cows, as my father would say, our cows give milk. When they're they have a really lush diet in front of them all the time, and they just give us milk. We raise Ashers, which was the breed that my forefathers were preeminent in raising and importing from Scotland. But each breed of dairy cattle has its peculiarities and particular uses. And for most of the cheeses that I make, I like a nice, what I consider a balanced milk between protein content and fat content. Some cows give an excessive amount of fat in their milk, and it's not the greatest for many cheeses, because when you're renneting a cheese, you need one cell of fat, 1 cell of protein for a calcium ion to bond them together. And whenever that's out of balance, one or the other is wasted. And you need to standardize. In a big production plant, they can standardize their milk, and they can siphon off the extra fat for other uses. We don't necessarily have that luxury in our process because we're small. We're making, with the 12 cattle, we're making probably on average about 500 pounds of milk a day. And the cheese business works in concert with our raw milk business, that whenever, basically to keep our milk fresh and really good, if, the retail cycle can be all over the place depending on weather, depending on holidays, people's routines, or it can get thrown totally kaplooey like it did with the pandemic, because we had like a run on the bank when anyone who had ever bought a gallon of milk from us suddenly showed up expecting that we would have one for them, and we couldn't keep up with our customers suddenly. And we haven't made cheese. We've only just gotten cheese back into production again, having caught up with our customers a bit, and with people settling down, and with buying some cows and stuff to meet the demand from our customers. because as a retailer, you cannot be out of product. So we constantly have to have some sort of surplus all the time so that people aren't disappointed. And that's where the cheese making works with our works in concert with our retail business to make sure that we have a way to use that milk, because once we have the cows producing so nicely, you can't just tell them to lay it off, you know. If you have them producing, you've got to keep them right there all the time.
As you mentioned, the quality of the milk affects the cheese. Can you speak a little bit more about what affects milk quality?
So we're using when you look at our milk supply, it's from one particular herd that's eating a particular diet. And all of my cattle are also very closely related to one another. They're a very homogeneous group. And so they respond to how we treat them. And that's what you want in herd management. You want them to respond. You want them all to respond to a lot of the same inputs, which is a reason for keeping them so closely related. But also their diet, as far as what they're eating, is really important for milk quality. And then just our regulation system in this country. Most of the cheese and butter you get comes from what we call class 2 milk. In this part of the world, in the Northeast, where we consume so much dairy, there are virtually no class 2 dairies. Everybody makes class 1 fluid milk. But most of the product that's produced in this country is made what we call class 2 milk, which means it can have higher bacteria counts, higher somatic cell counts, which are, somatic cells in milk are the cells that we use to gauge an animal's overall health and the response of her immune system. In essence, it's kind of like white blood. It's almost like white blood cells in the milk from cows. And cows kept in these factory farms and fed all reserve feed with never getting any reserve feed produce an entirely different milk quality than pastured animals who are eating nice, fresh stuff and aren't being fed basically industrial waste. And then freshness. So our milk, I don't know if you notice our milking machines, but we're still using what many people would consider kind of a primitive milking system by today's standards. But we milk each cow individually. We don't milk them into a pipeline, so that because things happen. A cow kicks off a machine. When you're working in a pipeline milking system and you're milking thousands of cows, lots of things happen and you get a lot of stuff in the milk. And you can take that for what you want it to mean, but lots of stuff happens in these big milking systems. And what you're getting in the store nowadays is really kind of well, I wouldn't feed it to my kids, put it that way, which is why I got my own cows. It's not nice, pure product, but we're basically selling.
So the next bit is a little bit about testing milk quality. As he was talking about somatic cell count, I'll show you what he uses to do some of his testing and record keeping.
Coloring agent is to be kept at room temperature with a silicone tablet that keeps it. My habit is to generally put my positive control in the middle and my two that I want to be. This needs to be returned from the refrigerator, kept in a separate box. to isolate it from other food product that might be in the refrigerator.
I wanted to have you touch a little bit about temperature, because I know you have a hot water system,
Right.
the temperature at a consistent rate. So could you speak a little bit about temperature in the process of handling milk and in the process of making cheese?
Sure. Generally, we think of anything below, milk is safe if you've got it below 50 degrees. We always chill it to 40, that's regulatory. But when you're in any fermentation process, particularly when you're working with lactic germs, you want to ferment with relatively low temperatures. Whenever temperatures get too high, you start producing kind of vinegary flavors, sour flavors, rather than nice fermented qualities. So you're keeping your, chilling milk as quickly as possible is preeminent if you're not going to use it right away. You can make cheeses really nicely from milk that's never been chilled. That way you're not taking it through a lot of temperature changes, which should increase flavor quality. But you always want to use real gentle heating whenever heating milk. You don't want to take it through a lot of abrupt changes. We use basically a recirculating hot water bath in our kettles or vats, whatever you want to call them, to change the temperature. And we control very precisely the temperature of that water for the particular cheese we're making. Some cheeses you're going to get fairly hot, and so you're going to gradually get them hot, and you can use relatively hot water to do that for your energy transfer. But most of the cheeses you make are really never going to get above 100 degrees. And so you don't need a real active heat source. You don't need a lot of heat in that. You want to have everything move slowly and gently, keeping the milk chilled so that you don't start any pathogenic bacterias. And depending on the milk quality and its source, if your milk is kept too warm and it had some yeasty organisms in it, you can produce what we call a gassy cheese, because those organisms can get going as well as your lactic germs. So keeping the milk well below 40 if it's in storage, waiting to be used, bringing it up, and then realizing how long, once you chill milk, you harden the fat, right? The fat takes about 48 hours to get really hard. And with that much chilling, the milk fat is really the essential ingredient in cheese. There's a lot of regulations surrounding how much fat has to be in certain cheeses to call them certain cheeses. But dairy fat can get fragile because of the fact that it's so hard once it's refrigerated. And so you have to be careful when you're pouring your milk and handling your milk, if it's been chilled, because you don't want to make butter before you make cheese. Butter essentially destroys the fat cells, their membrane, right? And you need that cell wall intact. So when you've got nice cold milk, handle it gently, and then warm it up slowly. Add your cultures or whatever they are going to be. And we generally ripen most cheeses anywhere from 60 to 72 degrees for what we consider ripening temperature and allowing a culture to get established. And then the finished temperature of every particular cheese is different. And that's part of what makes them happen. And it's kind of a cultural thing as well as a geographic thing. people close to the equator use more heat in their cheeses to get the water out of them than people further away from the equator. Your northern latitude people use very low, relatively low temperatures and a lot of acidity in their cheeses to get the moisture out. People close to the equator use higher temperatures and then do age, and like your Parmesans and Romanos are your highest heated cheeses. They will go up to in excess of 120 degrees to make those cheeses and basically cook the whey out of the curds and then salt them heavily besides to draw more moisture out, because they're in a relatively warm climate and the lower moisture content is important for preservation. I mean, that's culturally how all of these cheeses can be categorized as far as where they come from and how the people lived that made them part of their life.
That sounds good. I think
you want the essay answer, just ask.
I'm going to take a quick moment and show folks a clip.
We're putting a culture from the culture manufacturer directly into the milk versus making a bulk starter. We're making a Gouda today, and so we want a mesophilic culture that has also cultures in it for producing some diacetyl gas. We've got the milk a little bit warmed. Whenever mixing in a culture into milk, if you mix most of these cultures, if you drop them directly into cold milk, might coagulate and form lumps. This culture is designed for direct vat inoculation and has a beautiful flakiness to it that this manufacturer does with the freeze drying. And this culture almost never lumps. With each manufacturer, you'll have to follow their directions for their culture. They're sold by the DCU, and each packet is designed to inoculate a batch on a range from anywhere from 100 to 1,000 liters generally.
And I think while we're here, the next step is the acid test. So I'll play this clip as well.
Because this is gonna tell us where our milk is at the start of our procedures. It gives me an idea of how ripe the milk is. It also gives me an indicator of what the solids are in the milk. And the fun part is always getting your 10 ml on the nose at the bottom of the meniscus, and I did it my first try. I'm not gonna. But it goes. When you want to do this test is a color test. And so if you had two 10 milliliter syringes at home, you could do the same test with the same ingredients. This is sodium hydroxide. It's a laboratory grade. And I can't remember exactly what its N is offhand, but I think it's 1.0. I'm not sure. I think that's the number that I buy. Nice thing about the acid meter is that it is going to nicely introduce our sodium hydroxide drop by drop.
Cliff, do you want to speak any bit more about the acid test and the importance of knowing the quality of the milk then?
Sure. We use an acid meter as our primary control process control procedure where we measure the acidity of the milk in the morning as we put it into the vat. And that number of our milk from our herd is almost always the same, right? For us, it's usually 0.225, which means that we have 20, we say, so we express that as a percentage, meaning that it takes 2.25 milliliters of sodium hydroxide to neutralize the acidity of our milk. And once we add our culture for something like the Gouda, after we've added the culture, we measure acidity again prior to renneting, which shows us that the culture is working and that we have had a rise of acidity, or that the fermentation is active. Once we cut our curds, we start taking measurements of the whey's acidity, and it has dropped because the titration of acidity also measures the solids in the milk. And so it gives us a general overall picture of what we're dealing with each day in our herd. And it's almost always the same unless the herd is under some stress or there's been some other management change. Or when we sometimes standardize the milk to different degrees and we lower, like we generally sometimes take some of the fat out of some of our milk in order to raise the protein for some cheeses. And that milk will titrate to a different number. But titration of acidity is the way that I learned. There's other process control measures you can take. You can use a pH meter if you're more comfortable with that and you like something that's a little more immediate, because there is some subjectivity to the titration of acidity, and the person who's running that test needs to run it throughout the procedures, because you base it on your perception of when the milk turns pink, being your measure. And we all have different things happening in our eyes and have different measures of color. And so that's the only measure by it. But it's a fairly economical test to run on your milk. And it's not something to be concerned with until you get into handling volumes of milk where it's of real economic necessity that your process be controlled. But it is a good thing it isn't a bad thing to learn to do. And it's kind of like high school chemistry made real for you.
That's a good point. And while we're here, Denise asked, does using raw milk change how much direct set culture you should use?
In a way, yes. And I guess and it depends on how much confidence you have in your milking system too. The direct set cultures, but in general, the direct set cultures that you can purchase, they usually say on the label, not recommended for batch inoculate, for production of bulk starter. Because the germs that they're putting in direct set cultures, they've generally selected out and are the most active germs, and they work very fast. So in one sense, they're nice to use. Well, let me back up a little bit. Bulk starter is really good to use in raw milk cheeses, because when you use bulk starter, you automatically create an acid environment that reduces the threat of pathogenic bacteria being introduced, right? So I started out with my raw milk cheeses using bulk starters because it created an acid environment and I thought it was a safer procedure. But for regular production, when production days are erratic and you don't want to use old starter, it's really handy to have these direct vat inoculated cultures just sitting in a freezer ready to go. So the general DVI cultures work really great because they will create an acid environment very quickly. They work very quickly, but they do tend to use up all the lactose pretty fast, which is why they can't be recultured for bulk starter. But I use a lot of bulk starter type lab agents that are a more generous bouquet of organisms and not necessarily just all the fast ones for my like my Swisses and my Italian cheeses that I'm heating to, that I generally heat to a high degree. I actually like the slower races. I direct vat inoculate with them. They survive the cooking process of the cheese, and then they basically go on and live in the aging process. So I kind of have it broken down into two, my production broken down into two segments, where I'm generally using a direct vat inoculation for my cheeses that are going to ripen for a long time while I'm working with them that day. And then I use slower starters for ones that are going to ripen in my aging cooler kind of thing. So it gets to be a complicated question, and I'll try not to go on too long with that.
And to throw another factor in, how about using goat milk? What are the differences that one might consider when using goat milk?
Oh, goat milk needs to be handled very gently. The reason some people are offended by goat milk is generally because it's been handled badly. It is a very delicate milk, and once you break its fat molecules open, you get the scent of the butyric acid, which some people find offensive. And so it needs good chilling, and it needs gentle handling in the meantime. But it is a very naturally homogeneous milk with really fine fat globules. And so it's really excellent for some cheeses that require that kind of milk. Makes beautiful rinds on cheeses and is excellent for aging. We generally get it mostly in Chev and things like that in our markets now. Because those are very lucrative things to make. We don't see a lot of aged cheeses in goat milk, except from some real high-end production places. But goat milk, and also the feed efficiency of goats, their milk is almost always white. And that's an important thing to understand in milk and amongst dairy persons, is that if you put animals out if you took a group of animals from all these different breeds and put them out on the same pasture, you will get back different colors of milk. And it is generally a gauge of feed efficiency and the animal's efficiency at converting beta carotene into the omega-3 fatty acids, the whiter the product. Whenever we see colored milk, it's a sign that the animal has an excess of beta carotene in their system and is no longer processing it. And it's coming directly into the milk. And you almost never see colored milk in goats. It's almost always really, really white. And amongst the breeds of cattle, there's varying degrees of efficiency on that score. With the Channel Island cattle giving very yellow milk and not converting it, and up to the Holsteins. I mean, the Holstein is really kind of a fine breed of cattle. I know that they have the raw milk crowd casts a lot of aspersions on Holsteins, but there are some very nice animals in the world that are black and white. And some of them are even A2s. much to the chagrin of people who claim that that's an exclusive genetic. There's some nice black and whites in the world that on the right feed produce really nice milk, but in general, as a population amongst dairymen, Holsteins have always been considered a rather hard to digest milk, and they make a rather hard curd. And it's probably much of the reason that people think that they can't tolerate the milk from the store is that it's generally from Holsteins, on a rather poor diet, by the way. But if you found a nice group of Holstein Friesians on a nice grass diet, it's really a nutritious product that they make. They generally make a pretty high protein milk and a really balanced milk in terms of its protein to fat ratio. It's not lopsided. But each animal has its qualities, and you just got to work with it.
I love that sense of individuality between the breeds.
Well, we've taken millennia to develop these things, and they've been kept somewhat distinct. And then when you cross them, you can get all kinds of fantastic combinations. But I'm a purebred Ayrshire breeder, and we've gone outside of our herd for certain genetics, using basically we've used. I have like for as far as dairy cattle breeding, we keep several what we call cow families in the herd, so that they're distinct genes and in these different groups, but yet there's some crossover. But we were searching I wanted cattle with high components, because our cattle basically generally have 20% solids in their milk, which is really high for dairy cattle. And to get that, we went to and we use bulls from Finland, which basically had, after the Second World War, a lot of Scottish Ayrshires were sent to Finland to help rebuild the dairy herd. And so the Ayrshire registry allows these Finnish animals to be in our registry. And they're generally a better components animal than the American Ayrshire has become. Okay. And so that's what does that mean?
That was me forgetting to put curb on my computer and someone calling me. But without too much of a segue, could you start to talk about rennet? Somebody asked, do we really need rennet? What does rennet do?
Oh, no, you can do it without rennet. But if you're trying to run a factory, you need it. Because in a factory, we need things to happen on time. But if you have all the time in the world, or you have exceptional process control, you don't need rennet. You can strictly by the acidification, if the acidification of the milk happens properly with the right organisms, it will coagulate all on its own. And depending on the depending on the temperatures at which certain things happen, that will create your particular texture of your cheese. But rennet basically was discovered rather early on, probably when someone killed a calf and opened its stomach and saw what had happened to the milk inside the calf's stomach. They discovered what happens when calves drink milk. And it's basically the same thing that happens even when we don't go around killing babies, so we don't find out how it happens when babies drink milk. But in all mammals, when milk goes into our gullet and into our stomach, the acidification of our stomach curdles the milk. And curdling and basically cheese making mimics that process. But when they discovered, the early cheesemakers basically kept like a dried calf stomach, like hanging above their sink. And you only needed to take that piece of calf stomach and like wash it in your milk to help initiate coagulation, because it's loaded with an enzyme called chymosin, which acts as a catalyst in the reaction between the protein and the fat molecules in the milk. The key things happening to form a curd are the fat cells, the protein cells, and the calcium ions. And when the acidity is right, if the acidity is right, it will roughen up the surface of the fat and protein cells, kind of like a Velcro bonding sort of thing. And when a calcium ion slips in between, the cells just unite and coagulate, right? But you can speed this process up by adding a chymosin, which is a proteolytic enzyme that basically abrades the outer cell walls of the protein molecules, making them bond almost spontaneously to the fat molecules. And so you add rennet to milk, and within 45 minutes, you should have a curd, and which is why we use it, because that way we can get our production done. And we're just speeding up the whole process that basically happens in a calf's stomach.
I have a clip of
Bacteriizing it.
I'll share with everyone.
Have the milk agitating when the rennet goes in. It's up to you how you want to distribute your rennet. I basically use a thin stream for a long amount of time, but check your timepiece. You never want to stir longer than 4 minutes. And you maintain agitation. Also, depending on the cattle you're using, whose milk you're using. If you're using milk from any of the Channel Island breeds, which are the Guernseys, the Jerseys, and the Normands, you'll want to maintain agitation for the maximum 4 minutes, and then possibly allow yourself some top stirring time to keep their fat. Their fat rises extremely fast, and to obtain a uniform curd can be difficult with their milk because of that fact, depending on the cheese you're making. This with a Gouda, we really prefer the milk from breeds with more homogeneous fat, because this cheese requires a nice smooth skin for its outer surface so it doesn't get invaded by molds later on. This fat globule is some of the damaged fat from the handling of the milk. You never want to see too much of that. Milk, once it's the fats in the milk are fragile once the milk has been refrigerated and cooled, because the fats harden up. And then when the milk is either agitated or poured or transported or pumped, those cells get ruptured, and the fat is the most important component in any cheese. The fat is where all the flavor is, and so you want to be very gentle with it. So we're almost at our 4 minutes. I'm going to pause my stirring and I'm going to go to top stirring. And this top stirring is to keep the fat from rising too quickly. And you also want the temperature just to remain balanced and constant. See you in half an hour.
We'll jump right to the next portion, which is evaluating the curd.
On the side of the kettle. And I will just wiggle in. And it's what cheesemakers call a clean break. In other words, we can determine if we have a thick curd just by the fact that it holds its formation there, and clear whey shows in the break. Right? Or you go to cut it, and you see that the curd has a nice formation. Another test that cheesemakers will do is to take and form their index finger in the shape of a hook. Insert your finger in, and if you can make the curd kind of rise and hold on your finger. There's another test. There's a flocculation test you can perform by putting a light paper plate on the curd and giving it a spin and seeing how long it spins.
Cliff, do you want to mention anything more about the curd before we sort of jump into the next?
Just always be patient when you're first starting out with curds, because you'll frustrate yourself if they're really not fit. They'll just clog your cheesecloth. You want to have curds that are substantial enough to drain nicely.
Mm-hmm.
Just be patient. It doesn't always happen the way they say in 45 minutes.
Always do our vertical cuts first. This kettle has a round bottom, and so I have to follow that with the knife. And again, you don't whack and thrash at your curds. You want to go through them methodically, carefully. And then you go at 90 degrees to those cuts. The blades of this knife are about 1 inch apart. And curd size is an important dynamic for every cheese. Is one key determiner of the final texture of a cheese. And then you go through with your horizontal knife. You do not want to form what we call curd dust. If you don't handle your curds you can tell you haven't handled your curds properly if your whey is not clear. If your whey is cloudy, you rush or you weren't careful about something. You are trying to, by having really clear whey and keeping all of the components of the milk in the curd, you're going to have a more flavorful product. You're also going to have a better product overall, because your mission in handling the milk is to get all of the goodness out of it, right? And all of that goodness has to be captured in the curds. And then with a nice clean arm, I usually go around and loosen, make sure that there's no particles or as few particles as possible clinging to the wall of the vessel, because they'll inhibit the heat transfer. Because the other thing is we're going to want nice uniform heating throughout. And then come around and go in front of you. And this is just the initial cut of the curd. And to really experience any cheese making, you have to feel it. Feel what your curds are like. And this is what we're looking for as far as nice. These are really nice, soft curds. And we have really beautiful, clear whey. Now after probably around 10 minutes of rest, the curds have settled slightly and we can see the quality of our workmanship and the clarity of the whey. Now it's time to begin gently heating, warming, and cutting the curd to the size we want for our Gouda. And if I had a large mechanized vat, it would have an agitator and forks I would attach to the arms. But in my case, I just stir with my horizontal knives and to continue to cut the curd to a smaller size. And after seeing the curds have already firmed up to a degree, and they've been expelling water just all on their own from the cutting. Your ultimate yield on most hard cheeses is going to be less than 15% of the volume of your milk. And we'll begin a gentle heating. We'll probably have to increase the heat of our water bath. But Gouda is what we call a washed curd cheese. So we are going to do part of our warming by the addition of hot water. The washed curd cheeses, besides Gouda, are Edam, which is also another Dutch cheese, and Colby, which comes from the American and English school of cheesemaking. Basically, a washed curd cheese sets up through osmosis the loss of lactose, so there will not be as much free milk sugar in the cheese, and it will not get as sharp. It'll give you a milder flavored cheese. It will not be as acidic as a full-throated cheddar or other cheeses. Again, you do everything gently, methodically. I'm not trying to batter these curds. I'm trying to cut them to a smaller size. I'm increasing the surface area, and they'll expel that much more whey by raising my temperature. Start rising shortly. The Gouda employs both the rise of acidity and increase in temperature to expel whey from the curds. There's still a few large random chunks. But generally for a Gouda, I want them to be around 1/2 inch. And for a Gouda, I never really tighten them up. And likewise, the addition of salt tomorrow morning. So I need to add water to this, hot water to this curd. I'm going to add hot water that does not exceed 50 degrees centigrade. The other reason for being very gentle about your curd warming is you don't want to create what we call case hardening. Case hardening is when you feel the outer surface of your curds toughening. The outer surface of your curds toughen, they will no longer expel moisture, and you'll just be cooking them as they are. They won't be losing moisture as you warm them. I'm sure somebody, the reason that how we discovered washed curd cheeses was that someone's fire ran out and they weren't done cooking their curds, and they had some hot water and they added that to the kettle to finish getting the curds as hot as they wanted them, and then they found that that cheese had a different flavor than the cheeses that they used to make in their usual way. Because we're going to add hot water to bring us up to a higher temperature. And basically by adding water to the whey, we will have decrease. The whey has a certain osmotic pressure because of the other minerals in the whey. By putting water surrounding the curds with a less dilute solution will leach the lactose out of the curds. So we add hot water, and it may be necessary to reduce the volume of this kettle. We'll see how it goes. But likewise, that's why you want to make sure your water is not too hot when you add it. If you're just grabbing water from a faucet in a bucket and adding that into the kettle,
that drains right out back. And Cliff, if I'm not mistaken, that whey often goes to the pigs.
Yep, we make sure that it gets used. It does have lots of stuff in it. You've been as careful as you are.
Yeah, do you want to say anything about transferring to molds before we jump into this little video? Or about the cutting?
Yeah, in a big Gouda factory, they actually usually put weights on top of the curd for a bit to kind of condense it a little bit more and get some of the whey out before they mold it. But I use this cookie cutter approach.
prior to going into the press, you'd like your cheeses to be as uniform as possible. That's why a flat block kettle will be even greater.
Sorry, the volume's low.
So I basically use this is the cookie cutter approach.
We're basically just trying to get the cheeses uniform so that when they go into the press, the pressing can be balanced and not fall apart. So here, this is with the molds just inverted, allowing the weight of the cheese to sort of press itself and eliminate. That's why they're upside down like that. And then we reverse them and putting them into the nets to try and just to get the shape nice on them by pressing them in all directions as they gradually lose their way and condense.
And I remember part of the trick was getting the similarly sized
Yes.
balance themselves.
Yep, you can, and that's what this whole step-by-step business does.
Pressing time on these is basically until they've thoroughly cooled, which may take, if you've done it late in the day, could take overnight. And depending on the temperature of the room you're in. Once they've cooled to room temp, they're basically stable. Pressing all of the whole school of cheeses, Tomes, the Gouda and Edam, the Swisses, most of the Italian cheese, the curds are pressed while they're warm. And that is what gives us the dynamics of this beautiful rind. And it's primarily a physical thing that we're looking for in terms of smoothness and evenness. The only thing from coming out of this mold would be this little bit of an edge here. Your brine should have a nice kosher salt. And it's actually staying in one place, so I'll try not to move. So once you've created this beautiful rind, you need to get salt into the cheese. The cheese has to be at least 2% salt in order to be preserved. So the only way you can dry salt if setting up a brine is impossible for you. You can do what's called salting in the hoop, which would be to place salt in your mold and leave the cheese in the mold, salt it that way. That would be dry salting, but it's not going to be as accurate as immersing your cheese in a brine solution. And if you do dry salt, you want to maintain, every once in a while, move it and maintain moisture around it. The salt is going to travel through the curd and migrate through to the center eventually as the cheese is cured and ripened. The cheeses should float. If they're sinking down, that's a good indicator you don't have enough salt. They should kind of rise out of the surface of the brine. And depending on how many cheeses you've got and what you're doing on your batches, if you're doing a lot of batches of cheese, you may want to label the cheese so that it doesn't stay in there too long. If you do over brine and extra brine, that's going to give you a drier cheese, because over time your brine tank should fill up as it sucks the lactose, lactose-laden whey out of the cheeses. And that's why you don't throw the brine away, because the brine is going to create its own acid environment through the fermentation of the lactose that you're putting into it.
Cliff, maybe you want to mention a little bit about how you would go ahead and cure, and then we can open it up to some more questions.
It's the overall recommended with most cheeses is to start their aging on the cold side, so that you're encouraging the family of germs that like that environment and which produce a more balanced flavor. And you can finish your aging at higher temperatures later on if you want to speed it up. but always start initially rather cool, anywhere from 50 to 70, I would say. Swisses are, when they want to open the eyes in a Swiss, are in what they call warm rooms, which would maybe be in the 80-degree range. And then you can move them on the shelves of a room like that where the temperature stratifies to get different results at different temps. But anywhere around 50 degrees is really kind of an ideal temperature for ripening cheeses. You don't have to be below 40 degrees the way most, most health officials always want to see everything at 40 degrees or less. But that's not a great temperature for aging cheeses. 45 to 50 is really much more ideal. And each cheese then has a certain humidity that's good for it, etc. And then perhaps some sort of sealing process on the outside of the cheese. Some cheeses will create a natural rind where you let beneficial organisms populate the rind of the cheese. Other people don't want any molds involved, and there's all kind of coating processes you can use, everywhere from lard to cheese paints. We have all kinds of great acrylics that we paint on cheeses nowadays too, that do a great job of sealing things up and keeping the molds at bay, kind of thing.
And Denise asked, does the weight that you press the cheese at depend on the size of your mold?
The weight that you're using? Yeah, I mean, a big cheese is going to take, the size of the cheese will have a lot to do with how much weight you want to put on it, depending on your pressing situation. Like when I first was hobby making cheeses, kind of messing around, I would use a pail of water on top of my followers because I didn't have a press to exert, tons of pressure. Generally speaking, though, I can't say that pressing, I mean, it's really important. I generally have to use like the full weight of my press to form cheddars nicely and to get a smooth rind on them, because the curds for cheddar we've cut up in these nice cubes, and they're not that hot. If the curds are real hot or real warm when they go into the press, you won't really need all that much pressure to form them into a nice rind. Cooler. And then there's many cheeses that we don't press at all. Most blue cheeses are just pressed under their own weight of the curd itself. And also just maybe by hanging and keeping, you've seen those Italian cheeses that are sort of hung in a cloth with rope around them and whatever, or string around them. That's allowing the weight of the cheese or the tension you can get in the cheesecloth to basically create the smooth skin that you're after. So there's lots of ways of doing it. You don't have to have a press, but it's nice. It's convenient.
And there's a few questions about the vegetarian rennets, and specifically liquid thistle rennet. What do you think?
Have gone to avoiding the vegetable rennets primarily because in one sense they're generally the manufactured rennets generally tend to be pretty potent. And my only caution with vegetable rennets is you don't over rennet with them, because they are pretty strong. And when I mean strong, it's the amount of chymosin as a proteolytic enzyme. The action of rennet continues for forever unless you denature it. Rennet works at between 70 degrees and 104 degrees. After 104 degrees, if you get hotter than that, you don't have to worry about the formation of bitter peptides. But I made this mistake, and I've seen many other cheesemakers make the same mistake of using too much rennet and then creating bitter peptides in the cheese, because the rennet action continues for a long time, and the longer it ages, it can form bitter peptides in a cheese. And the vegetable rennets will tend to do it more because they basically have a higher potency than natural calf rennet. And then the other thing that can be specious in some rennets is that many of your rennets are basically bioengineered, which some of our clientele wouldn't like either. So there's lots of stuff going on as far as how they ferment certain rennets, and most of the manufacturers aren't clear on that. And so I've just been very happy and more clear conscience by always knowing I use nice calf rennet from France all the time. Because that's the other thing. In America, most of our animals aren't acceptable for the production of rennet, aren't trusted because of antibiotic use in livestock in this country. So, I mean, there's it's one of those big questions as far as why, but good calf rennet from other boundaries than ours are what I prefer, but, and that I've had the most consistent results with.
Great. There's, I think we have another question here. I'm looking at it now. Rachel is asking about how to learn to do this at home. And it sounds like cheese might not turn out as well if you purchase some milk at a farm and drive it home. It would still be better than milk from the grocery store though, right? Also, I'd love it if anyone had good recommendation of a plan to make a press or just what to look for.
Well, making a press isn't really all that difficult. Like I said, if you have a decent, like I made early on, I made all my stuff from food grade plastic pails, right? I would cut the bottom out of a pail and use that for the follower. And then I would use a similar size pail just sitting on top and fill it with water and have my cheesecloth inside the pail. Because I didn't want to spend a lot of money on this stuff if it wasn't going to work. Because when you go to these cheese hobbyist websites, there's still good molds and everything are still pretty hellaciously priced. Most of them, like those Cordova molds that I'm using now, I would have never dreamed that someday I could afford those. When I first started out as a hobbyist, I was like, $100 for one little mold, it's a lot of money. And they're worth it if you're in the business, but you can do the same thing. I generally recommend, and I sell in my store, this nylon cheesecloth that works really well. It doesn't have the tensile strength of muslin. Muslin cheesecloth is nice, but curds do stick to it, and keeping it clean can be difficult. So even though the nylon cheesecloth doesn't have great tensile strength, you can't really hang a big heavy curd with it. But you can line a colander with it and curds never stick to it. You can line your molds with it and curds won't stick to it. It'll perform nicely. And you can make your stuff from pretty easy stuff. And then when it becomes worth it to you, you can step up to the fancy stuff from Glengarry Cheesemaking is a great retailer of.
Yeah, I would have told you about the cows escaping.
Yeah, okay.
Aren't you glad I couldn't find you? We've gone up to Green Hill Road.
Oh, they got out up there again? Okay.
Yeah, because Isaac's the first
We've got
person.
cows out.
Isaac's the first person I ran into. Aren't you people lucky? I'm walking around looking for people.
Okay, I'm in the middle of something.
Okay.
That's Eileen full of
It's been fun though.
So yeah, just a pail of water on it or a brick, a good sized brick on top of your follower will also do the same thing. Because I have to admit that most of the hobbyist things that I see them selling, I think are real disasters.
And to speak about the bit about driving home with your milk, I think.
I mean, if you've been getting milk, I mean, I guess I'm not sure what the raw milk dealers are in your area. But if you can get a dairy farmer, a regular commercial dairyman that you're comfortable with to sell you some milk, I mean, you'll definitely, price-wise, you'll do really well with regular dairymen because they're getting dirt for their product most of the time. But if you have someone you're buying raw milk from, the important thing, and if you're going to buy it from the store, what you want to buy is skim milk and cream, because the skim milk will have the protein in it, and then you can add the amount of cream you want, and it'll be whole. But you just never buy homogenized milk, and you can't make yogurt or cheese or anything from homogenized milk because they destroy the cell membranes of the fat in the milk and you need an intact cell wall to bond and make a coagulum. But you can buy cream, heavy cream, and you can buy milk in the store if you want for your initial investigations. And I would usually use wouldn't work with anything less than a gallon, and I would generally work with at least 2 gallons so you end up with a couple of pounds when you're done. And start out with a nice farmer's cheese initially, just something quick and simple, or even a camembert is really not hard to make. Just a nice coagulated milk put into a form and allowed to drain as the acidity rises. But the New England cheesemaking will always, on any of your Google search, New England cheesemaking will always come up at the top of your search for cheese supplies. And then usually following that will be Glengarry cheesemaking in Canada. And they both sell all kinds of good stuff to get you started.
That's great. And one final question. Someone asked if cheesemaking.com. Have you ever heard good?
Well, that's her.
Oh, that's Glengarry.
That's that's New England cheesemaking.
Thank you all for joining us. Again, if you found this event inspiring and helpful, please consider becoming a member or making a donation to help us continue our important work. Thanks as well to our sponsors, Real Pickles, and grant funders, the Berkshire Taconic Community Foundation and the Massachusetts Dairy Farmers. We have several more online educational opportunities you may be interested in. Friday, June 18th, we'll be hosting Michael Gallagher of Square Roots Farm to learn more about their intensively managed livestock systems. And Connor Stedman will also be joining us to explain the principles and practices of further developing pastures into silvopasture systems through functional tree planting here in New England. And as well, our NOFA Summer Conference is going online for the first time, July 20th through June 9th. Even though we aren't meeting in person this year, that doesn't mean you can't attend the NOFA Summer Conference. With over 60 workshops and speakers, ranging from agroforestry to vermicomposting, this year's virtual conference will not disappoint. Register today and gain access. And you can find out more information about all of these events on our website, nofamass.org/events. Thank you all again for being a part of the NOFA Mass community, and I look forward to seeing you next time.